It's the 2nd of August 1980. The waiting room at Bologna train station is packed. It's a hot day and the waiting room is one of the few air-conditioned areas, but the hundreds of passengers amassed there are about to have their thoughts of travel plans, dinner arrangements and daily worries scattered to the four winds because, in a moment, a huge explosion will rip through the station. It seems no one's noticed the unattended suitcase. Housed within it is death. Death in the form of a bomb made with 23 kilograms of explosives. It will leave 200 injured and 85 dead. Sadly, it's just the latest in a series of attacks that will work in favour of the right-wing leadership, drawing the left-leaning public into the arms and protection of their government. A smart but cynical government who are using a disaster for political gain, using the old adage of not letting a crisis go to waste? Not quite. It's much, much worse than that. So bad, it's almost unbelievable. This time, it's Operation Gladio. Let's get weird.
The history of mankind is riddled with the weird and the wonderful. Bizarre people, strange places, and odd events. For centuries, we've told each other fantastic stories around campfires and in darkened rooms. Tales of ghosts, UFOs, and conspiracies. But are these stories exactly that? Stories? There's only one way to find out. Dive into the rabbit hole and enter Marc W. Shako's Weird World.
Hello and welcome to Marc W. Shako's Weird World, and on this conspiracy episode we follow up on conspiracies that turned out to be true with Operation Gladio. If you've never heard of this, you're not going to believe it, or you're not going to want to believe it. There's a bit of everything in here. You'll hear expressions like strategy of tension, Hegelian dialectic and the term false flag. I'll explain that one and its origins in a moment, and we will return to the shocking scenes at Bologna station soon enough. But I said that Bologna train station was just the latest in a series of terror attacks. 6 years earlier, on the morning of the 28th of May 1974 in Brescia, thousands had turned out in the town square for an anti-fascist protest. A bomb placed inside a rubbish bin at the east end of the square detonated, killing 8 and wounding 102 people. In May of 1972, 163 miles to the northeast in Petiano, an anonymous phone call went into the Carabinieri, which is the Italian military police. Hello? Look, I would like to tell you that there is a car with 2 holes on the windshield in the road from Poggio Terza Amata to Savogna. It's a Fiat 500. The Carabinieri are dispatched, finding the Cinquecento exactly where the caller said they would, parked in a dirt lane. They may have never said it outright, but the mention of holes in the windscreen implies bullets, so there may be bodies inside. It's while they're investigating the vehicle, the Carabinieri decide to pop the bonnet of the car. That's when the bomb housed within it exploded. 3 military police were killed instantly. 2 others were seriously injured. Back further still, on the 12th of December 1969, a series of attacks took place. A bomb exploded in a bank in Rome. Another was found unexploded in the tomb of the unknown soldier. But the worst of them all, in terms of loss of life, and how else should we categorise these things, was at the Piazza Fontana in Milan. An explosion at the Natural Agricultural Bank killed 17 and wounded a further 88 people. Just imagine for a second being in Italy on that day and hearing the news about coordinated terror attacks. An explosion here, another there. It reminded me of something. And if you were an adult in September of 2001, it probably did the same for you. Anyway, according to good old Wikipedia, on the 25th of April 1969, a bomb exploded at the Fiat booth at a Milan trade fair, in which 5 people were injured. There was also a bomb discovered at the city central station. The explosion at the Piazza Fontana was not the first, but part of a well-coordinated series of attacks." End quote. These attacks were carried out by a neo-fascist group calling themselves Ordine Nuovo, or New Order. The scary part is, they were part of something much bigger. Operation Gladio. This brings us back to Bologna station. The explosion there will destroy the majority of the main station building, hit the awaiting Ancona-Chiasso train at the first platform, and collapse the roof of the waiting room on top of the awaiting passengers, greatly increasing the total number of fatalities. The blast will be heard for miles. Just like those before it, the explosion at Bologna station is another attack that will work in favour of the right-wing leadership, drawing the left-leaning public into the arms and protection of their government. A smart but cynical government using disaster for political gain? Not quite. You see, they were in on it. You heard me. Welcome to the terrifying world of false flag terror. So what is all this false flag business? Well, the term stems from naval roots. Ships at sea carry the flag of the nation from which they hail. However, a tactic used in battle would be to change flags and fly one of a friendly nation before attacking, thus maintaining the element of surprise, hence false flag. As I said at the beginning, false flags were only part of Operation Gladio, but what exactly is Gladio and why did it start? I'll get into more detail in a moment, but in a nutshell it goes like this. During the Cold War, intelligence arms of NATO countries wanted to prepare for resistance in reaction to the Soviet Union's Warsaw Pact with Eastern Bloc nations. So, they left agents in territories as stay-behind armies. It was these so-called invisible armies in charge of scaring the shit out of the citizenry. Because a scared citizenry is a compliant citizenry. They would use this strategy of tension to chip away at the rights of their citizens. Of course we can protect you, but there will need to be some changes. You may have to surrender some of your freedoms. You'll often hear this referred to as the Hegelian dialectic. The Hegelian dialectic is a philosophical concept developed by Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Hegel's concept involves a process of understanding and resolving contradictions through a triadic structure: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. The thesis represents the current state of affairs or an existing condition, the status quo, how things are now. The antithesis is direct opposition to this, challenging or contradicting it. The synthesis is the resolution that integrates the truths of both the thesis and the antithesis into a new, more refined state of affairs. You'll often hear this boiled down to problem, reaction, solution. The powers that be have a problem with the status quo and desire to take things in another direction, in their eyes, a better way. Better for who? That's just details. But this new way is the solution. But change is a slow process. People don't like change. They need a catalyst. Something that will trigger a reaction. The trigger will get people to beg for the solution. Surely, this can't be real. Can it? First of all, there's absolutely no way that a government would kill their own citizens for political gain, let alone outright admit to it. Apparently one of Winston Churchill's favourite sayings was never let a good disaster go to waste. It's much more likely that the terrorists were busy doing their thing, and the powers that be simply took advantage of the circumstances. After all, this isn't House of Cards. Even today we see terror attacks and other atrocities such as mass shootings used to gain some sort of leverage, whether it's stealthily nabbing the rights of the people or swaying election results. It's much more likely that those in charge are just taking old Winston's advice. The other option is unthinkable, isn't it? Isn't it? Well, no. It isn't. Officially, Gladio began in Italy in 1950. The OSS, that is the Office for Strategic Services, who would later become the CIA. I said who would later become the CIA? Were preparing themselves for a future where the Soviets would occupy Europe in much the same way as the Nazis had. The idea was to use stay-behind armies as a ready-made underground resistance in case the Soviets got a bit handsy with Europe. Where did this idea come from? Well, As the Allies marched through Europe at the end of the Second World War, withdrawing German forces left secret agents behind. These were often SS agents and the staunchest believers in the Nazi ideology. Advancing ahead of their Allied counterparts were OSS agents. It was their job to weed out these stay-behinds. They gave themselves the rather cool name of X2. Jim Angleton was the man from X2 who actually started recruiting fascists as stay-behinds of his very own, believing they would be the best to oppose the threat of communism coming the opposite way. On the night X2 arrived in Rome, police officer Federico Umberto D'Amato had been doing his homework. He had a list of German stay-behinds which he rounded up and handed over to X2. The Germans were jailed, handed over to the Americans, and dealt with. As reward for his part, D'Amato ran the Italian secret police for the next 40 years. The newly formed NATO actually had an amendment made, off the record of course. Anyone wishing to join NATO had to agree not to prosecute right-wing activists. This included former Nazis. Compartmentalization meant this was often done without the knowledge of governments. These Italian Gladio teams were trained, again, off the books, by the SAS in Hereford, and by another group, although the whistleblower could not say if they were army or intelligence. But the levels of secrecy were such within the leadership of Gladio that talks were often held not in offices, but on walks in the park, like the bit in JFK with Donald Sutherland. Early on, there were concerns in the US that Italy could actually vote in a communist party in their 1948 election, the commies polling at around 30% at the time. The concerns were so great that it was put to the US President and Secretary of State that the elections should be cancelled. When those at the very top laughed this suggestion out of office, the response was, "Fine, we'll run the elections then. We'll even compete." Remember, this is before the official launch of Gladio. There are some who believe that this realization that the nascent US intel had no charter for such activities is the reason Gladio was actually born. Just by the way, they were not needed. In the 48 Italian elections, good old bribes did the trick, which reminds me of the old saying, if voting changed anything, they wouldn't let you do it. Were there any other examples of election interference, I hear you cry? Well, I'm glad you asked me that. See, it wasn't just Italy that had a communism problem, so it wasn't just Italy that had stay-behinds. Other European countries had their own versions of Gladio. The name Gladio refers to the Italian branch of the operation, but is now used as an informal name for all of them, because it wasn't just Italy involved. There were branches of Gladio in Denmark, France, Germany, Greece, Netherlands, Norway, Portugal and Turkey. And it wasn't just in NATO countries either. Parallel stay-behind operations also took place in non-NATO countries like Austria, Finland, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland and Belgium. We'll turn to Belgium for another example of interfering in an election. That term does not come close to doing what actually happened justice. Julian Lowe probably butchered that pronunciation. Lahaut is the spelling, if you fancy giving that a Google. Anyway, Julian Lowe was the honorary president of the Communist Party in Belgium and had become a symbol for workers' rights and action. Belgium was going through some stuff after the war. King Leopold was returning from deportation after World War II, but Belgium was split on whether they even wanted him back. The left had no interest in being ruled over by a king, but the right, and perhaps more importantly, the US Embassy, wanted to see the king back on his throne. So, just before the elections, the Belgian equivalent of Gladio stepped in. In 1950, Julian Lowe was assassinated by a right-wing secret army. 27 years later, on his deathbed, a Secret Service agent confessed to the assassination. After Gladio was set up officially in 1951, it didn't take long for things to go bad. In 1952, it was revealed in the Italian press that assassination teams were running about, and in Germany, a group had decided to align themselves with whoever they had to, running contrary to the anti-communism theme. They even went as far as drawing up a list of potential politicians who might be sympathetic to their cause with the intention of organising a puppet government. And it wasn't just that German branch who had such conflicts. From the very beginning, Gladio was divided into two spheres of influence. British-aligned countries included the Netherlands, Belgium, Portugal and Spain. Others were influenced by the US. Just as a quick aside here, one of these influential CIA agents was Frank Wisner. You might remember his name from the True Conspiracies episode, which was number 7, and Project Mockingbird, a man who boasted he could play the media like a mighty Wurlitzer to influence the public. Oh, and Jim Angleton? His name's just surfaced in the recently released JFK files. Lovely people. So, if everybody had their own stay-behinds, who was in charge? The chairmanship of Gladio is passed between the member nations, which sounds like the presidency of the EU, but I digress, is coordinated in Brussels, coincidence, by the CPC, that's the Clandestine Planning Committee, who meet periodically, kind of like, but not necessarily, the Bilderberg Group, and independently of NATO. It does sound like Gladio morphed with the times because according to Vincenzo Vinciguerra, Gladio switched between left and right-wing causes depending on whatever was needed. I suppose that would depend on whoever was pulling the strings and what ends they wanted to achieve. And the main reason I believe Vincenzo is I think he has a pretty good idea of what he's talking about. He was behind the killing of the 3 carabinieri at the Petiano massacre. He was also put on trial for the Bologna station bombing in the mid-80s, saying, "With the massacre of Petiano, and with all of those that have followed, the knowledge should by now be clear that there existed a real live structure, occult and hidden, with the capacity of giving a strategic direction to the outrages. It lies within the state itself. There exists in Italy a secret force parallel to the armed forces, composed of civilians and military men in an anti-Soviet capacity, that is, to organize a resistance on Italian soil against a Russian army. A secret organization, a super organization with a network of communications, arms and explosives, and men trained to use them. A super organization which, lacking a Soviet military invasion which might not happen, took up the task, on NATO's behalf, of preventing a slip to the left in the political balance of the country. This they did with the assistance of the official secret services and the political and military forces." Political assassinations to sway elections, cancelling elections, getting involved in elections, doing it all from the inside too. If this is the kind of thing you've researched to any level, sadly none of it will come as a surprise, but does it still happen? There are examples all over of this kind of thing going on. How much of it was connected to Gladio, we may never know. But one recent example of CIA involvement in regime change that sounds exactly like Gladio is the 2000 Yugoslav elections when incumbent Slobodan Milosevic was up for re-election. The CIA spent tens of millions of dollars in Serbia to foment a colour revolution to bring down Milosevic. Here's a quick bit from AI about colour revolutions, including one bit I found particularly interesting. Quote, "A colour revolution is a term used to describe a series of political events that primarily occurred in the post-Soviet space in the mid-2000s. These events are categorized by mass street protests and riots aimed at achieving a revolutionary change of government, often involving the demand for free elections or regime change and the removal of authoritarian leaders. The term colour revolution was adopted because protesters often wore a specific colour or used a particular symbol, such as the Rose Revolution in Georgia in 2003 and the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004. Here's the interesting part. Critics, including Russian officials, have accused the Western world of orchestrating these colour revolutions to expand its influence. Given what we now know about Operation Gladio, are they really wide of the mark? Something else to question is where the CIA is getting tens of millions to fund this stuff. There are some who dig way deeper than I would ever care to on geopolitics who say that the recent USAID scandal is connected to all of this. That the handing over of massive amounts of taxpayer money overseas was part of a huge laundering scheme that went in part towards funding Gladio-style operations. Makes you think. What has been confirmed in that scandal, just as an aside, are payouts to media companies, and if you were paying attention in that True Conspiracies episode, that will sound an awful lot like Operation Mockingbird. Go and check that one out if you haven't already. I'll drop the link in the show notes. Now, enjoy this short word from our sponsors, which is me.
For more spooky strangeness, visit www.markwshako.com. And now, back to the episode.
In the early 80s, in Belgium, a series of attacks took place on military bases. For months after the official story was common criminals or terrorists, and the strategy of tension was working a charm. Former Belgian paracommander Lucien Disler knew otherwise. He said in an interview that he was actually working as a bank manager in the early 80s when he was contacted to help with the special manoeuvres alongside American Special Forces. The mission? Recovering American paratroopers and taking them to predetermined locations to carry out attacks on gendarmerie barracks. The Chasseurs Ardennes was attacked shortly after, fences cut, armories raided, guards wounded. The general consensus among civilian authorities was that they had gone too far. The throwing of a grenade close to the office of the Attorney General perhaps the straw that broke the camel's back. The planned attack on Vielsen barracks, scheduled for some time shortly after, was put on ice. Those charged with delivering the Americans to the sites of the attacks were informed on the day of its cancellation. The Americans asked Lucien to take them anyway, as a standby. He did. The next morning, while out with his wife, Lucien heard on the radio that the barracks had been attacked. A guard was taken to hospital seriously wounded. The media were used to spread the word, and the fear, that the attacks were the work of the far right, the far left, foreign governments, or foreign intelligence services, all with the aim of shocking the public and destabilizing democratic society. The fact that weapons and munitions had been taken during previous attacks, no doubt furthering that tension and fear within the country. As bad as things were, they were about to get much worse. On the 9th of November 1985, masked men entered the Delhaize supermarket in Aalst and opened fire on civilians. A family of 4 ran into the shooters in the car park after they left the shop. The mother, father and daughter were killed without apparent motive, while the surviving boy was shot and severely wounded in the hip. 8 people were killed and several others seriously injured. Group G was a section of the Belgian version of Gladio. The G stood for gendarmerie, and the group was made up entirely of police officers. Group G wanted to separate themselves from the other factions involved, fearing being spotted at protests, for example. Marshal Lecoux was a Belgian gendarme from 1972 to 1984 and was recruited for Group G. He spotted senior police officers sharing documents with terror group leaders. He approached his higher-ups in December of '83, 2 years before the Delhaize attack, surprised at the slow pace of investigations into this wave of killings. He obviously knew there were members of the gendarmerie involved and heard about attacks planned on places like supermarkets. He was told by senior investigators they knew exactly what was going on, and then he was told to shut up and mind his own business. He left the police after threats were made to the lives of his children. So, just as British special forces and intelligence were training the Italians, similar training was going on in Belgium, and extreme groups were being infiltrated, and then a ramping up of violence soon followed, including attacks on immigrant cafes. There was also organisation of things like military training camps and surveillance, and according to the interwebs, the Brabant killers, behind this group of attacks and others, abruptly ceased their activities in 1985. And despite significant resources dedicated to the case, the most recent arrests connected to the case are of the now retired original senior detectives themselves for alleged evidence tampering. The covering up of Operation Gladio. In 1968, a series of student revolts spread across Europe. As well as in Brussels, there were riots in Paris, Frankfurt and Milan. And coming out of this were armed leftist action groups, including the Red Army faction and the Red Brigade's Brigate Rossi. On the 16th of March 1978, left-wing terrorists kidnapped the former Italian Prime Minister Aldo Moro. On the same day, the Italian Parliament were due to debate the inclusion of the Italian Communist Party in a government of national unity for the first time since 1948. Moro believed their inclusion was the only way to bring about political stability in his homeland, but he had said to his wife he had been warned that if he went ahead with this plan, groups strongly opposed to it would make him pay dearly. 55 days after his kidnap, a phone call came in from the Red Brigades telling police they would find the body of Aldo Moro in the nearby street of Via Caetani. More than half the bullets found at the scene had no date of manufacture and a special coating used by special forces. Just as groups in Belgium had been infiltrated and co-opted, so had the Brigate Rosse. According to classified documents coming out of the Rome station, the planning staff from the Red Brigades were taking orders from General Santovita, the head of the Italian Secret Service. You're probably thinking, or maybe hoping, all of this sounds like fiction. Invisible armies blowing their own people up is all well and good as the plotline for a Frederick Forsyth novel, but this is real life. The problem with that is this quote from memory-holding specialists Wikipedia. US intelligence agents were informed in advance about several right-wing terrorist bombings, including the December 1969 Piazza Fontana bombing in Milan and the Piazza della Loggia bombing in Brescia 5 years earlier, but did nothing to alert the Italian authorities or to prevent the attacks from taking place. Advanced warnings of terror attacks that were not acted upon, because it kinda helped what those pulling the strings behind the scenes wanted to achieve. Those familiar bells will be ringing again. It reminds me of, well, that's for another episode. Or 3. For those still in doubt, there's a documentary on YouTube saying all of this Gladio business is true. Oh well, if it's on YouTube, but wait. I'm not talking about some foil hat wearing conspiracy nut fan fiction, like me. It's a 3-part documentary with interviews from all of the main players, police, intel insiders, prime ministers, terrorists, actually admitting their part in the dastardly scheme made by a little organisation from the UK going by the name of the BBC. Put BBC Time Watch Gladio into your favourite search engine and catch it while you can. It's powerful stuff. I say catch it while you can because the memory holing is real, folks. Naturally, in the doc, the CIA are trying to distance themselves as much as possible from what went down, but the Italians, Vinci Guerra particularly, are laying it all out, and it's as shocking as it is captivating. In 1990, Judge Felice Casson discovered Gladio while investigating right-wing terror. On the 9th of November of that year, the Italian Prime Minister went in front of a shocked Italian Parliament and revealed the existence of Operation Gladio. One more conspiracy theory that turned out to be true. That's all from me. Thanks for listening. Until next time, keep it weird. The intro music is Slasher by Carl Casey at White Bat Audio, check out his YouTube channel. The outro music is Lone Wolf by Guillaume Bernard. Please remember to like, subscribe, rate, review and share this episode wherever you may have heard it. And you can find me on Facebook and X as Marc W. Shako. For more information on my books and all things podcasty, visit www.marcwshako.com. Thanks for listening.